Okay. The committee, or I guess in this case the committees, will come to order. This hearing is a hearing of the Natural Resources and Foreign Affairs Committees. The Foreign Affairs Committee will take the lead with the first panel, and the Natural Resources Committee will take the lead with the second panel. Without objection, all members will have 5 days to submit statements, questions, and extraneous material for the record, subject to the length limitations and the rules of the respective committees. Chair Elliot Engel couldn't be here today, and he figured I'd done 23 years on the Foreign Affairs Committee, and I could probably handle this. We'll see if he's right or not. The purpose of this hearing is to provide members of both committees with a deeper sense of strategic importance of America's relationships in the Pacific region, particularly those with the freely associated states. The title of this hearing is the U.S.-Pacific Insular Relationships. America's legacy in the Pacific goes back well before World War II, but is best known for World War II, or my own father fought in some of the very islands we're talking about here. A failure to focus adequate resources and attention on this region in recent years has opened the door to other regional actors. Most obviously, China has taken a growing interest in the Pacific Islands. Further west in the Pacific, they're building some of their own islands. But our focus here is on islands created by God rather than man. Just last week, China pressured not one, but 2 Pacific Island states to change their diplomatic recognition from Taipei to Beijing, with the Solomon Islands and Kiribati switching their allegiance to Beijing. It's worth noting that 2 of the 4 Pacific Island states that still recognize Taiwan are freely associated states, namely the Marshall Islands and Palau. And the topic we're here to discuss today, of course, is the freely associated states, the Marshall Islands, Palau, and the Federated States of Micronesia. We share a very unique relationship with these 3 sovereign countries. The compacts we have with them serve as a foundation for our exceptionally close ties. FAS, or Federated citizens, have the right to live, work, and study in the United States without a visa. FAS citizens serve in the U.S. military at rates exceeding most of the states in the United States. The importance of Pacific Islands should never be understated. They control, both strategically and economically, an area considerably larger than the continental United States. And as our technology makes the oceans more important, these islands will become more and more important. We enjoy close coordination with all 3 governments in a number of areas, including counter-narcotics and illegal fishing. The Department of Education provides Pell Grants, the U.S. Postal Service provides domestic mail service, and the National Weather Service, Federal Aviation Administration, and FEMA also provide critical services. They are among our closest diplomatic allies at the United Nations and provide the United States with unfettered military access to their land, waterways, and airspace. In turn, the United States is responsible for the defense and security of the freely associated states. Suffice to say that the compacts create bonds between the United States and these 3 countries that are closer than we enjoy with any other sovereign nation. Despite these historic ties, we have heard from FAS leaders that all too often it seems the United States has drifted away. Too often our policy seems to be on autopilot. A good example of this was Congressional inaction on the last compact we signed with Palau. Although the compact was signed in 2010, Congress didn't get around to funding it until 2017. This clearly upsets the relationship, didn't actually save taxpayers any money, and the delay seems to reflect a lack of attention where attention is called for. The current compacts are scheduled to elapse in 2023, 2024. Furthermore, the trust funds we helped establish to provide for these countries' economic development have not performed as well as we would have expected. Accordingly, the freely associated states are not capable of making up for the shortfall when our financial support to these countries ends. To prevent a reoccurrence of what happened with Palau last time, we must get ahead of the issue, and that is one of the reasons we're holding this hearing, to get all of our colleagues in Congress to focus on the importance of the freely associated states. We are holding this hearing to solicit good ideas from this knowledgeable panel on how to strategically shape our engagement with the freely associated states and other partners in the region. The freely associated states should not have to choose between inattention from their long-term friends and the debt traps and other devices which would erode their sovereignty, which will no doubt be offered by China. We not only have the expertise of 2 panels of witnesses, we also have 3 Pacific Island delegates to the United States Congress participating in these hearings, people who live and represent the region and will also, through their questioning and comments, give us a substantial understanding of the area. I want to point out that we have created a Pacific Islands caucus co-chaired by Ed Case from Hawaii, myself, Ted Yoho, and Don Young, and this will also help focus the attention of Congress on this important region. With that, I'll recognize the acting ranking member from the Foreign Affairs Committee, Ms. Wagner, for her opening statement.
I thank the chairman very much, and I want to welcome our witnesses today and to thank them for their work in support of U.S.-Pacific insular relations. The ties between the United States and our partners in the Pacific are of immense strategic importance, and I'm glad that the House Committee on Foreign Affairs and Natural Resources have the opportunity to highlight this as we draw closer to the renegotiation of our compacts of free association with the Federated States of Micronesia, the Republic of the Marshall Islands, and Palau. Strong relations with Pacific Island nations are the backbone of U.S. security in the Indo-Pacific and have been since before the Second World War. And for decades, Micronesia, the Marshall Islands, and Palau have played a central role in developing U.S. capabilities and extending our ability to protect sovereignty, rule of law, and freedom of navigation in the Indo-Pacific. Increasingly, the Pacific Islands are on the front lines of Sino-U.S. rivalry. China has already begun to pressure Pacific Island countries in an attempt to push the borders of its sphere of influence out to the so-called Second Island Chain, a line that passes right through the northern Mariana Islands, Guam, and Palau. Last week, China coerced 2 Pacific Island countries, the Solomon Islands and Kiribati, to break with Taiwan and instead recognize Beijing before the Communist government's 70th anniversary on October 1st. China seeks to replicate its diplomatic victory in Palau and the Marshall Islands by weaponizing its economic clout. It has banned Chinese tourists from visiting Palau, and it currently forces Marshall Islands ships to pay higher fees to enter Chinese ports. The United States must stand by its partners and its allies as they face down a belligerent and strident Beijing. China does not share our vision for a free and open Indo-Pacific. It seeks to intimidate, entrap, and coerce the countries with which it works into increasing China's prestige and furthering its own agenda. We in Congress are proud to support the special relationship the United States shares with the Marshall Islands, Micronesia, and Palau. The United States must continue to stand together with the freely associated states in defense of our common interests. I want to thank again, Chairman, for organizing this hearing. It's wonderful to have representatives from our Pacific Islands here and to be teaming up with natural resources as we delve into this. I yield back the balance of my time, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. It's my understanding that the gentleman from Arizona has asked that his opening statement time be used by my friend Kilili from the Northern Marianas Islands. The gentleman from the Northern Marianas Islands is recognized.
Thank you very much. I thank my colleague for yielding to me. I quote today's hearing, believing the time has come to begin defining a new era for the United States relationship with some of our closest allies, the freely associated states of the Republic of Palau, the Republic of the Marshall Islands, and the Federated States of Micronesia. And in so doing, I also hope to signal to the Pacific region writ large that the United States remains committed, more than ever committed, to this part of the world. The United States political history with the freely associated states began at the end of World War II. The United Nations Security Council entrusted us to administer these former colonies on behalf of the international community. We were charged with fostering the development of their political institutions and promoting their economic, social, and educational advancement. Speaking as someone who grew up at this time in the Marianas, in Micronesia, in the trust territory of the Pacific Islands, which has also been entrusted to the U.S., little was done at first to fulfill these responsibilities. Only after the Cold War was in full swing did concern grow that a lack of commitment to political and economic development might jeopardize long-term U.S. security interests in the Pacific. And because of that concern, the U.S. significantly increased assistance. In fact, the U.S. built such a strong bond that Palau, the Marshall Islands, and the Federated States of Micronesia all chose to become freely associated, and the people of my home voted to make the Marianas Islands an actual part of the United States and chose to become United States citizens. Perhaps the United States forgot the lesson in the 1970s, because today we're facing a similar dilemma. Instead of combating Cold War concerns, however, today's challenges are coming from other Pacific powers who want a realignment of allegiances in their favor. And the U.S. neglect of our relationship with Palau and the Marshall Islands and the Federated States of Micronesia could well be encouraging these friends to turn elsewhere. In the more than 30 years since the Compacts of Free Association were entered with these three island nations, the United States has provided more than $4 billion in direct financial assistance. We have established 3 trust funds, the earning of which we had hoped would eventually substitute for this aid. Today's hearing will begin weighing this U.S. assistance to these friends against the growing influence of other powers in the region. So we must ask ourselves whether we're doing enough in return for the military and defense rights the freely associated states has given us, including the right of strategic denial to block or restrict military access by third countries. While the U.S. has hoped to see a certain level of economic growth through their targeted financial support, we must be honest, growth has not been what we had hoped. We may need to provide more aid, particularly in light of the GAO's 2018 report that the FSM and the Marshall's trust funds face risk and may not provide the self-sustaining disbursement in future years that were envisioned. While we are at the infancy stage of fulfilling the interagency's strong support for extending financial assistance, which we are told is vital to secure long-term U.S. strategic interests, we must avoid a repeat of the compact renewal with the Republic of Palau. That renewal was agreed between our two nations in 2010. I introduced legislation to approve it, but Congress did not take final action until 2018, much too long to keep a friendly neighbor waiting. I want to thank our administration witnesses and thank them for being here. Your presence underscores the importance of this issue to national security. I commend the administration for its willingness to secure and strengthen our nation's relationship with these allies who vote with us at the United Nations more than any other nations. And finally, I want to welcome my friends, Ambassador Jacquias from the Republic of the Marshall Islands and Ambassador Susea from the Federated States of Micronesia. Welcome. I look forward to hearing about your government's priorities for enhancing and moving the relationship with our two nations forward. And thank you, and Mr. Chairman, I yield my time back.
Thank you. It's my understanding that acting as ranking member for the Natural Resources Committee is the resident commissioner from Puerto Rico, who is now recognized for a 5-minute opening statement, after which I'll recognize others in attendance who are interested in making a 1-minute opening statement. That doesn't mean you need to.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I appreciate it. I think this is a great opportunity to have a Foreign Affairs Committee and the Natural Resources Committee jointly doing a hearing about a very important issue for the United States security, but also for the interests of the United States in the region. As a member representing an island, I know how important it is to acknowledge all the situations in the past 50 years, as well as the status of the compact. In that regard, we'll be reviewing the United States' relationship with and interest with the freely associated states, the Republic of the Marshall Islands, the Federated States of Micronesia, and the Republic of Palau. I welcome the ambassadors as well as the members from the government of the United States for this first panel. Our relationship with these three independent island nations dates back to the World War II, as the chairman just established, and is currently governed by compacts of free association that serve mutual interest. The freely associated states defer to the U.S. on decisions related to their external security and receive U.S. economic assistance and security guarantees. In return, our nation has access to their lands and waters for strategic purposes, and more importantly, we have the ability to deny other countries the same access for providing that kind of security. As Ms. Wagner just said a few minutes ago about the increasing interest of China in the region. In 2023 and 2024, the financial assistance authorization provided by the Compacts of Free State Association as amended and the Compact Review Agreement are set to expire. The financial assistance provided under this agreement has been essential to the three island nations. I therefore look forward to having this productive discussion on how this expiration could impact the daily life of the freely associated states. And I also want to know about the implications it could have on the United States' strategic interest in the South Pacific region, particularly whether it could create a leadership void that other nations like China might seek to fill. I want also to hear from our witness on policy options these committees can discuss and we can pursue to increase the freely associated states' economic self-reliance and ensure a brighter future for those countries. I want to thank both chairmen for calling today's hearing. And after having, for the first time, a joint meeting with the President of the United States in May of this year from the three independent states, I think it's the first time that happened. And lastly, in August of this year, Secretary Pompeo got a separate meeting discussing the same issue with one of the islands. I think this is the right time to have this kind of discussions and how can Congress help in this regard. I want to recognize Ms. Amata Radegwagan from the American Samoa Island, which is part of the Natural Resources Committee in the House, that is part of this delegation as well, representing actually the Pacific Islands. With that, I'll give back the balance of the time.
Thank you. I'll see if anyone needs, yes, the gentleman from Guam is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm deeply grateful for this joint hearing that we're going to be conducting here today for the purposes of really getting to the bottom of our relationship with the Compact of Free Association and those states that are so associated. It's important for us in the context of today's hearing to remember that the reputation of the United States as an administering power is no better represented than in our U.S. territories, our tribal nations, and our freely associated allies. And this relationship is wholly responsible for establishing our reputation on the world stage. No matter how much we go out diplomatically to try and talk about whether or not the United States is a good partner or a good ally, it is entirely reflected in whether or not our territories, our tribal nations, and our freely associated allies are succeeding or failing. And the success or failure of these administered areas rests largely with the Department of Interior. And so, Mr. Chairman, I'm very grateful for this hearing so that we can discuss the success, particularly of our freely associated allies and the administering responsibilities of the Department of Interior, because the soft power implications of our ability to get this right has direct relations to our hard power responsibilities in maintaining peace and security throughout the globe. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you. I understand the gentlelady from American Samoa would seek recognition. Recognized for 1 minute.
Talofa lava. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Chairman Sherman, Chairman Sablan, and Ranking Members Wagner and Gonzalez-Colon for holding this joint hearing on this very important issue. And thank you to the witnesses for taking time out of your busy schedules and coming here to testify. Special greetings to Ambassadors Zacchaeus and Susaya Nikpula. The freely associated states are near and dear to my heart. Whenever I have the opportunity to visit any of these island countries, it feels like I'm being welcomed home. In fact, I actually did have the privilege of living in the Marshall Islands for a number of years. The freely associated states are arguably our most important allies in the Pacific. Not only are they important security partners, the people of these island countries have a direct cultural and social impact on the United States and the territories. Their citizens live and work in our communities and serve in our military. They are our neighbors and family members. The American government doesn't just have an obligation to these island nations. The amount of value we receive out of our agreements with the FAS means we owe it to the American people to maintain these relationships. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you. I see no other members seeking recognition, so we'll now move on to our first witness. Randall Shriver began his career in the Navy, served in important positions in the State Department, went on to positions in the private sector, and now serves as Assistant Secretary of Defense for Indo-Pacific Security Affairs. Mr. Shriver.
Thank you. Good morning, Chairman and ranking members. Appreciate the opportunity to be here today to talk about these important relationships with the freely associated states. Our relationships with the freely associated states are critical to advancing our strategy to promote the free and open Indo-Pacific. We are advantaged by a deep and rich shared history, but also shared values and interests. We in the freely associated states believe strongly in respect for a safe, secure, prosperous, and free and open Indo-Pacific region that must preserve the sovereignty of all states, no matter their size. We stand together with these important allies and will sustain U.S. security guarantees to the freely associated states. The importance of these efforts is growing as we are increasingly confronted with a more assertive and confident China that is willing to accept friction in pursuit of its interests. There are, of course, other challenges that we work with our partners in the freely associated states in the Indo-Pacific, such as persistent and evolving threats from non-state actors, emerging threats across new domains such as cyber and space, and a range of transnational threats, such as natural disasters, illegal, unreported, and unregulated fishing, piracy, drug trafficking, and the impact of climate change. But our strong relations with the freely associated states, we have a particular concern by China's use of coercive tools to attempt to erode their sovereignty and induce them to behave in accordance with Chinese interests. As was mentioned, China has applied pressure to Taiwan's diplomatic partners, including Palau, with the banning of Chinese tourists and the economic coercion that the ranking member mentioned that led to a switch in diplomatic recognition on the part of two Pacific islands just last week. Our policy response at the Department of Defense is through implementation of the National Defense Strategy, in which the freely associated states feature prominently in its implementation. We seek to build a more lethal and resilient joint force where we prioritize investments in key technologies and key areas of modernization, and the freely associated states are partners with us on this effort. As an example, the Marshall Islands host the Reagan Ballistic Missile Defense test site, which provides tremendous opportunities for us in our modernization efforts. The site enables cutting-edge U.S. Army and Air Force space and missile defense research and is leading to advanced technologies such as hypersonic test programs and the development of advanced surveillance systems. Also related to the implementation of our national defense strategy, we seek to strengthen alliances and attract new partners. These networks are critical to our ability to protect the U.S. and enable our forward presence, but it also gives us partners who are more capable to defend themselves and contribute to regional security. Consistent with growing partnership capability and in line with the 2018 BOA Declaration, we aim to build capacity and resilience, particularly to address challenges such as maritime security. The freely associated states are also critical to our department's long-term strategy as they grant us access and they support us in international fora. All three countries also contribute to our mutual defense by their service in the U.S. Armed Forces, as was mentioned by the chairman and other members, at per capita rates higher than most U.S. states. And their citizens have paid the ultimate sacrifice with lives lost in combat in Iraq and Afghanistan. The freely associated states are also active contributors to the international pressure campaign on North Korea. We work with the Marshall Islands and Palau, for example, to prevent use of their ship registries to evade sanctions against North Korea. In Palau, the United States is working to provide radar equipment and technical support critical to improving maritime domain awareness, including air and surface awareness in the South and East China Seas. The radar will enhance our ability to compete with China in the region and will enable Palau to understand what's happening in its own sovereign territorial waters. To conclude, we are part of a whole-of-government engagement strategy in the Oceania region, and we're engaging in important ways. We've conducted an unprecedented number of DoD senior-level visits to the region in the last year and a half. We're also stepping up our work with like-minded allies and partners, such as Australia, New Zealand, France, and Japan, to protect the sovereignty and maritime rights of the Pacific Islands. Going forward, we also recognize that compact guarantees and obligations are critical in the context of competing effectively with China, as Beijing is actively targeting this region in an effort to expand its own influence. In this regard, the Department of Defense strongly supports our interagency efforts to extend the economic provisions of the compact to secure our long-term strategic interests in this vital region. Thank you again and look forward to your questions.
Thank you. Ms. Sandra Oudkirk is a career diplomat. She's Deputy Assistant Secretary for Australia, New Zealand, and the Pacific Islands in the Bureau of East Asian and Pacific Affairs at the Department of State. You're recognized.
Good morning, Chairman, ranking members, distinguished members of both committees. Thank you for the opportunity to appear before you today with my distinguished fellow panelists. As has been noted already, the Indo-Pacific is the most populous and economically dynamic region of the world. The U.S. interest in a free and open Indo-Pacific extends back to the earliest days of our republic. Our relationships with the Republic of the Marshall Islands, the Federated States of Micronesia, and the Republic of Palau, collectively referred to as the freely associated states, have, since World War II, contributed to a secure, stable, and prosperous Indo-Pacific region. Together, these three countries form a strategic bridge, stretching from Hawaii to the Philippines, a span equivalent to the breadth of the continental United States. As has been noted, we have full responsibility and authority for security and defense matters in or relating to these three countries. We can deny other countries' militaries access to these countries, and the three governments consult closely with us on their foreign policies. Importantly, the freely associated states hold strong to their core democratic values. This is the foundation that underpins our relationship and our cooperation. As Secretary Pompeo said during his August visit to Micronesia, these small islands are big strongholds of freedom. They are proven partners and friends. The Marshall Islands, the Federated States of Micronesia, and the Republic of Palau are historically among the United States' strongest supporters at the United Nations. The freely associated states stand with us to combat anti-Israel bias and stood with us on the Jerusalem vote. In addition, Palau and the Marshall Islands are two of the now 15 countries that maintain diplomatic ties with Taiwan. We work closely with the freely associated states on the full range of law enforcement issues. We train law enforcement personnel from all 3 countries. We conduct joint maritime law enforcement patrols, and we cooperate on law enforcement investigations. Eligible citizens of all 3 countries can and do travel without visas to live, work, and study in the United States. Citizens of the freely associated states serve in the U.S. Armed Forces at rates higher than most U.S. states, and 18 service members have lost their lives in combat since World War II. The United States must continue to deepen our engagement with the freely associated states, especially now, at a time of increased competition from China, Russia, and other countries who seek to exert greater influence in the Pacific region. Our compact relationships do not have an end date. However, the scheduled end of U.S. economic assistance is rapidly approaching, and now is not the time to leave these small, sovereign partner nations open to the predations of larger countries. For example, China has significantly increased its engagement with the Pacific Islands over the past decade. China has provided $1.8 billion in economic assistance to the Pacific Islands since 2006, now putting it third in terms of donations, behind Australia at $7.7 billion, and the United States at $1.9. China's engagement is still growing. Against this backdrop of growing competition, there is uncertainty across the Pacific about the United States' willingness and ability to sustain the robust bilateral presence that has contributed to peace, stability, and prosperity in the region. Our allies, partners, and other Pacific Island countries see our relationships with the freely associated states as a bellwether, as a signal of our commitment to the broader Indo-Pacific. On August 5th, during the first visit by a Secretary of State to the Federated States of Micronesia, Secretary Pompeo announced that the United States will begin consultations on certain provisions of our respective compacts of free association with each country. We are coordinating closely across the interagency to evaluate our options. These agreements are complex. They require a thoughtful approach with extensive consultations to make sure that we get them right. An interagency group will travel to all 3 countries in October to better understand the needs and perspectives of each of the 3 countries. We are committed to working collaboratively with Congress to explore ways in which we might further strengthen our relationship with the freely associated states. Chairman Sherman, Chairman Sablan, Chairman Grijalva, ranking members Wagner and Gonzalez-Colon, distinguished members of the committee, thank you again for the opportunity to appear before you today. We look forward to working closely with you and your colleagues in Congress to ensure that the United States can effectively secure U.S. interests in the Indo-Pacific. Thank you.
We have with us the executive branch's liaison with the freely associated states. He is Nicolau Pula, the Director of the Office of Insular Affairs at the Department of the Interior, and he is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, ranking members of the committees, and the distinguished members of both committees. Thank you for the opportunity to testify before your committees this morning. I am Nick Pula, Director of the Office of Insular Affairs at the Department of Interior. Having traveled to each of these countries multiple times, I can assure you that the Federated States of Micronesia, the Republic of the Marshall Islands, and the Republic of Palau share a unique and special relationship with the United States. My colleagues at the Departments of State and Defense discussed diplomatic and military importance of our relationship with these freely associated states. I will focus on the financial assistance provided by Congress through Interior. The Department has partnered with the people of the former trust territory of the Pacific Islands since 1951, when the Navy transferred civil administration to Interior. Given our historic role, Congress determined then that compact funding would flow through Interior. That continues today. No other independent nation with diplomatic and military relationships with the United States also has a relationship with the Department of Interior. This can be attributed to the unique and special history that we have shared and continue to share going forward. This compact framework has successfully ended their trusteeship status and restored stable, sovereign, and democratic self-governance to the freely associated states, while providing the United States with continued access to this strategic region. The compacts allow their citizens entry into the United States visa-free as legal non-immigrants to live, work, and study here. Many families and individuals now live in the United States and also serve in the United States Armed Forces, adding to the growing American Pacific Islander diaspora, another source of strength to the United States' relationship with the freely associated states. Through Interior alone, the U.S. has provided the FSM and RMI approximately $3 billion in financial assistance over the last 15 years, from FY 2004 to 2019. From 1994 to 2009, Palau benefited from U.S. financial assistance totaling approximately $560 million. And under the 2010 Palau Compact Review Agreement, passed by the Congress last year, an additional total of $229 million was made available to Palau. The financial assistance included in the compacts for the FSM and the RMI has primarily supported the delivery of health and education services, infrastructure, development such as hospitals, health centers, roads, utilities, and schools. The compacts have also established trust funds for the FSM and the RMI to provide an additional source of funding when annual grants funding eventually ceases in 2023. The U.S. compact relationship with Palau is different but similar. Financial assistance to Palau supports government operations, infrastructure projects, and a trust fund. Neither the United States nor the freely associated states intended for any of the compact agreements to underwrite the entire economies or the full operations of each country. Rather, the compacts were intended to provide an economic springboard, making available the resources to allow the FSM, RMI, and Palau to improve essential government services and infrastructure while they reform the business climate, fiscal policies, and their capacity to govern. The Joint Economic Management Committees with the FSM and RMI, both established under the Compact Law, provide an opportunity for annual bilateral discussions on financial assistance issues and serve as additional accountability mechanism. Compact grant assistance and payments to the trust funds for the FSM and RMI expire in 2023 and for Palau in 2024. As currently structured post-2023-24, the trust funds provide a transition away from direct U.S. grant assistance and towards economic self-sufficiency. At the end of FY 2018, the balance of the FSM Trust Fund was $636 million, RMI's was $402, and Palau's was $286 million. However, while the trust funds have grown and performed well, there are legitimate concerns about the expected distributions after 2023 and 24. If funding under the compact is not extended after 23 and 24, or the trust funds are not bolstered, the FSM, RMI, and Palau are all likely to experience significant economic shock with detrimental disruptions to health, education, and government operations. The stability and balance of our relationship in this region that we have engendered thus far may suffer. Thank you, and I'm happy to answer any questions.
Thank you for your testimony. David Gutnick is the Director of International Affairs and Trade at the U.S. Government Accountability Office. He also leads the department's work on the compacts of free association. Dr. Gutnick.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Chairman, ranking members, and members of the committee, thank you for the opportunity to participate in this hearing. I'm going to focus in some detail on the economic assistance to the Republic of the Marshall Islands and Federated States of Micronesia, introduced by my colleague, Mr. Pula. Under the amended compacts with Micronesia and the Marshall Islands, sector grants and special education grants, known as the SEG, are scheduled to end and trust fund disbursements to begin in 2023. In my remarks today, I'll focus on two key issues associated with this transition. First, the extent to which the two countries currently rely on U.S. support, and second, the status of their trust funds. First, on reliance on U.S. assistance. The sector grants in the SEG continue to support a substantial portion of government resources in both countries. In the FSM, these grants were roughly 1/3 of all government expenditures in 2016, and nearly 1/2 of their expenditures if you add in other U.S. programs and services, which I'll get to in a moment. In the FSM, the reliance on these grants varies considerably by state. Chuk State, with the largest population and the lowest per capita GDP, is the most reliant on these grants. There, these grants support about 85% of the health sector and 95% of the educational system. The Marshall Islands is somewhat less reliant on these grants. Overall, they support about 1/4 of government expenditures, yet they represented about 1/3 of the health sector and 2/3 of the educational system. Both countries are also facing a transition in the availability of U.S. programs and services provided for by the compacts and their implementing legislation. After 2023, some of these programs and services are set to continue and some are not. So, for example, based on current U.S. law and the assessment of agency officials, FEMA funding for disaster relief and the services of the U.S. Postal Services will no longer be available. Likewise, the FDIC will no longer have the authority to ensure deposits in the Bank of Micronesia. Other programs and services, such as the FAA's civil aviation and USAID's disaster response, may continue under other authorities. And yet still other programs and services can continue without change. For example, eligibility for Pell Grants, special education grants, and numerous public health programs will continue. There's an addendum to my written statement which provides an analysis of the status of most U.S. programs after 2023, and I think it's a useful reference on this complex topic. Regarding the trust funds, at GAO we recently ran 10,000 simulations of the trust funds under a range of scenarios. We found that under their current structure, the trust funds are unlikely to consistently provide annual disbursements at the level of sector grants and may provide no disbursements at all in some years. These risks increase significantly over time. So, for example, in our analysis, the FSM faces a 40% likelihood of zero disbursements in 1 or more years in the first decade after 2023. It's a greater than 90% risk if you run that analysis out 40 years. For the RMI, the risks are somewhat lower. It's 15% in the first decade, yet more than 50% over 40 years. These results are entirely consistent with those of the Asian Development Bank and analysis funded by Interior. These risks have been known for some time, and there have been proposals to mitigate these shortfalls. A number of these proposals rely on changing the constraints on disbursement built into the trust fund agreements. However, absent a reduction in planned disbursements or an increase in contributions, these changes in and of themselves do not resolve the shortfall in the trust fund balances. Additionally, some of these proposals represent changes in the trust fund agreements, and on the U.S. side, this would require implementing legislation. Finally, migration under the compacts is set to continue after 2023. The most recent enumeration shows roughly 38,000 compact citizens residing in Hawaii, Guam, and the Mariana Islands. Compact nation citizens have been recruited by U.S. firms, and migrant communities in the continental U.S. are growing, and in many cases, quite successfully. GAO has and will continue to provide information on the demographics of compact migration and insight on the key issues faced by migrants and the affected jurisdiction. Chairman, ranking members, members of the committee, this completes my remarks. I'm happy to answer your questions.
Thank you. We'll now go to recognizing members. Rather than recognizing myself, I will recognize the chair of the full committee, Mr. Engel.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank Mr. Sherman for his hard work in working for this very important issue, and also in our 2172 Foreign Affairs room. So thank you so much, Mr. Sherman. Thank you to the witnesses for testifying on the many elements of the important and unique relationship between the United States and the freely associated states. And I'm very happy that we were able to organize this joint hearing with Chairman Grijalva, Vice Chairman Sablan, and the other members of the Natural Resources Committee, who have, along with the Foreign Affairs Committee, taken the lead on relations with the freely associated states over the years. I look forward to working with the National Resource Committee as we engage on these issues in the months and years ahead to ensure that we have a good outcome to upcoming negotiations on new compacts of association so the U.S. and the freely associated states can strengthen our ties, safeguard our sovereign interests, and ensure our mutual defense well into the future. Despite the deep historic ties between our nations and the region's strategic importance, there's frankly not a lot of awareness about the freely associated states here in the United States. This hearing provides a good opportunity to put them back on the radar screen. Our relations with the freely associated states are a very important part of our overall Indo-Pacific strategy. The way we handle the compacts will demonstrate not only how we treat some of our closest friends, but America's commitment to the Pacific as a whole. So I'm very glad that we have an opportunity today to discuss how the United States and the FAS can deepen and broaden our bilateral engagement. And again, I want to thank Mr. Grijalva, Mr. Sablan, and Mr. Sherman. I have one question I'd like to ask Ms. Oudkirk. I've long believed that the United States should have diplomatic representation in every country of the world. Recently, during his visit to the Federated States of Micronesia, Secretary Pompeo said he was examining how our government can best interact with the freely associated states to put our relationship on a sound footing for the decades to come. May I ask you, what do you think about reassigning responsibilities for the freely associated states from the Department of Interior to the Department of State or some other agency, and what would be the advantages and disadvantages of doing so?
Thank you very much, Chairman Engel. So just to be very clear, we have accredited ambassadors in place in each of the 3 freely associated states and embassies in each of those countries. So the State Department does conduct our diplomatic relationship with those 3 countries as per normal as we would with other countries in the world. The difference is, as Mr. Pula noted, the Department of Interior implements the assistance under the compacts. So I think we believe we have a good arrangement, a good division of labor here. And additionally, Mr. Gutnick described many of the domestic programs that are made available to the freely associated states, from the post office to the weather service. And that's also additional and somewhat unique, but the diplomatic and foreign affairs relationship is conducted by the State Department.
Well, how many State Department officers are assigned to U.S. embassies in Correa, Colonia, and Majuro, and are these resources sufficient to achieve U.S. interests and goals?
If I may, sir, I will take that question back and give you a precise answer. I think that we believe that we are doing a good job. We are in the process of augmenting staff in many of our Pacific embassies, not just in the freely associated states. But I will get back to you with a precise number on the breakdown of the representatives country by country.
All right. Thank you very much, and thanks to all our witnesses for testifying today. Thank you.
Thank you. The gentlelady from Missouri is recognized.
I thank the chairman very much. Ms. Oudkirk, is that correct? As I asked Assistant Secretary Stilwell last week before the Asia-Pacific Subcommittee, have you considered traveling to Taipei in accordance with the Taiwan Travel Act to demonstrate America's support for Taiwan in the wake of the Solomon Islands and Kiribati's decision to break with Taiwan?
I am traveling to Taiwan in 2 weeks. I am the U.S. senior official for APEC, so in my APEC capacity, I will be traveling to Taiwan to consult with them on APEC-related issues.
Much better answer than I
Hallelujah.
received last week. Yes, and the chairman concurs. That's wonderful, and I'm so pleased that you're going to do that. We need to make a strong statement about this, and I believe that Assistant Secretary Shriver underscored that also in his testimony. We cannot have China bullying our friends and allies in the region, and it's very important that Taiwan understands how important strategically, in trade-wise, in our values and support that we have for them. So I'm very, very pleased to hear that.
Would the gentlelady yield just for 1 second?
Absolutely.
I just want to associate myself with her remarks. I'm the co-chair of the Taiwan Caucus, and on both sides of the aisle, I think what you just expresses our views as well. I thank my friend.
Absolutely, and I just love it when we have these wonderful bipartisan moments of agreement. So, Ms. Albuquerque, what steps will the Trump administration take to make sure that support for Taiwan among the Marshall Islands and Palau, the freely associated states that recognize Taipei's sovereignty, make sure that does not erode further?
So thank you very much, Congressman Wagner. Taiwan is a democratic success story. It's a reliable partner. It's a force for good in the world. The United States will continue, and this administration will continue to support Taiwan, especially as it seeks to expand its already significant contributions to addressing global challenges, and in particular, its support to its diplomatic partners in the Pacific, including the Republic of the Marshall Islands and Palau. We believe that China's active campaign to alter the cross-strait status quo, including by enticing countries to discontinue their diplomatic ties with Taiwan, are harmful. This effort undermines regional stability. It undermines a framework that has been established for decades and that has enabled peace, stability, and development across the Indo-Pacific.
Thank you. I very much appreciate your testimony for the record, and I think that it is a very good setup for your trip in 2 weeks to Taiwan. I look forward to an outreach on that, and I think many on the committee do, and we hope that you'll come back and visit with us about that. Assistant Secretary Shriver, can you explain how the freely associated states fit into our defense posture in the Pacific, a little more broadly?
Thank you. They are very important partners across a range of activities, as I mentioned in the testimony, the research and development, the security cooperation on issues like North Korea. With respect to posture in particular, they provide opportunities for logistics support. If you look at the distances from Hawaii to Guam and through other areas of the Indo-Pacific, there are nodes there that are helpful in logistics support, and certainly in the case of a conflict, they would be absolutely critical. They provide access for training, such as Pacific Partnership. There are possibilities of future facilities, but no decisions have been made at this point to build out further other than in the areas I mentioned.
If the U.S. Department of Defense no longer has the right of denial over foreign military activity in the freely associated states, how would that affect U.S. national security?
We would be greatly concerned, particularly if the absence of that right of denial then led to a more permissive environment for access to certain actors. In particular, we'd be concerned about Chinese access there. So we are grateful for that, and we think it's a mutually beneficial relationship.
You may not have time to answer this, but let me just say that, Assistant Secretary Shriver, that China is clearly seeking to build military dual-use infrastructure throughout the Pacific Islands, such as piers that can accommodate Chinese Navy ships. What are China's dual-use infrastructure plans for the region, and what would these facilities mean for our defense?
I think the Chinese are very opportunistic, and they're looking for permissive environments where they can use economic assistance and infrastructure support, such as piers, that will create later access opportunities for the PLA. So it's something we watch very carefully and want to make sure that our influence and our relationships are as strong as possible to prevent that.
Thank you. My time has expired. I yield back.
That's neat. At this point, I'll recognize the Chair of the Full Natural Resource Committee, the gentleman from Arizona.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for the hearing and for the work of our respective staffs on both committees, and for putting this together to the witnesses, of course. Dr. Gooddick, the situation with the trust fund. and the predictions in terms of its viability going forward. Absent any real change, any readjustment, any renegotiation, the scenario you laid out, maybe you can repeat that part of it again?
Sure. Well, the trust funds were established with the intent of preserving the corpus, the body of the trust fund. And that was the focus at the time they were set up. There are three separate accounts: the corpus, a disbursement account, and a rainy day fund, if you will. And rules that govern funds being shifted between those funds and funds that are available for disbursement. That's the constraint that in the short run may lead to years where there are zero disbursements, or a number of years where the disbursements do not equal the value of the sector grants that end in 2023. Now, there was no specific provision that the trust funds would meet the value of the sector grants, but that is kind of a benchmark that a number of people have used.
That's perhaps an expectation at some point, that it would meet the benchmark, but it's not part of the agreement?
The agreement does not explicitly and fully limit the distribution to the inflation-adjusted sector grants.
Mr. Pula, if I may, we've heard primarily about national security in opening statements and much of the testimony, and I don't disagree with that. There's an urgency there, and that urgency has to be dealt with. But since 1951, when Interior assumed the responsibility, and the Interior and the Resources Committee assumed the responsibility of that jurisdiction, we talk security has been part of the issue. But I want to get from you, there's a humanitarian side to this issue as well. I understand the national defense security thing. There's not an issue of argument or either or, but it's a both question. And the humanitarian concerns that we have in terms of the degrees of services and attention that we bring to the people of those of the FAS. So let's talk about that humanitarian side of this issue and the responsibility that this Congress and Interior has to make sure that that's part of the equation. And sometimes I hope we don't lose that part in the discussion about the need to backstop China and do all those other things that I don't disagree with at all. But there is a human side to this, and those are the people on that island and the migration attendant to that. If you would.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. You know, I've been doing this job for the Department of Interior for over 20 years. And I can tell you and the members of the committee that dealing with the freely associated states have been a special part of my personal work, and in terms of the department, in cooperation with the State Department, with the ambassadors that are in the three countries. It's been an experiment.
More to the point. The investment that we are currently making to deal with all the issues and to strengthen the relationship, my perception is it's not enough, and so I'm asking.
Well, let me say, Mr. Chairman, that the law, the compact or the current agreement provided funding that we work with. Now, if your question is that enough, my answer would be it depends on who you ask. And mostly, the way we deal with the Department of Interior working with the three freely associated states, as you may well recall, during the Cold War, when we came up in 2003, in the beginning of this amended compact, which ends in 2023, the agreement that we now have provided for some accountability. And the reason why I said that the first 15 years, funding was going to the countries, and Congress felt, well, you know, so what do we have to show for? So in 2003, the United States provided funding on 6 sectors. And So in those six sectors, we basically, the primary ones are health, education, infrastructure, and then the other minor one.
So the answer on the investment question I asked you is, it depends.
Yes.
Yield back, I think my time is up. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I'll now recognize the resident commissioner.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My first question will be, Mr. Schreiber, in your written testimony, you know that a concern with China's use of coercive tools to attempt to erode Pacific Island sovereignty and to induce them to behave in accordance with Chinese interests. What do you mean by that? In terms of the tools, what tools?
We see economic coercion, the use of debt trap diplomacy. We see diplomatic and political pressure, the sense that China's large in the region, not going away, and you need to deal with us on our terms. So they have a range of ways of applying pressure, and it's increasingly difficult, particularly for smaller states, to stand up to that, which is why I think our partnership with the freely associated states and others is so important.
And you also say that for those specific nations to behave in accordance with Chinese interest, what specifically does China want them to do?
Well, there's tremendous pressure.
Taking a loan?
Ma'am, first of all, I would say there's tremendous pressure on the remaining diplomatic allies of Taiwan to switch diplomatic recognition. And we saw two countries last week make that sovereign choice to change, and there's pressure on Palau, pressure on the Marshall Islands. There's a range of other things that China may ultimately apply pressure. Their positions on the South China Sea, their positions in international fora. We see them apply pressure to their partner countries in those instances, and certainly the Pacific Islands could be susceptible to that as well.
Does the United States currently have any plans to build any additional U.S. military facilities on those free associated states?
We are, I think, in a process now of reviewing plans and reviewing posture. I think we're grateful for the opportunity to have these relationships that give us options, and as we look at the logistical needs, the access needs for contingency planning, we'll certainly be in consultation with our partner countries on those issues.
Thank you, Mr. Pula. One of the main issues is you got a lot of experience in the Department of Interior in the renegotiation of the compacts and the renewal of one of them. In your experience, what will be the financial impact if funds are not continued beyond the 2023?
Thank you for the question. As we look at the trust fund, the current compact agreement, the funding, the direct assistance that we provide now for the last 15 years until the end of 2023 will end, and then the trust funds will kick in. Just real short, if you look at the balance of the trust funds, they will not make the level of the current funding that goes to both the RMI and the FSM. Of course, that all depends on how the market does in the trust funds. So to answer the question, there are gaps. The RMI's trust fund is a little better. The FSM has a larger gap, and we hope when we get there, and as of course, as was mentioned by my colleague from State Department, Secretary Pompeo had already announced sort of like the renegotiation. So in that sense, those are some of the things that the administration are now kind of working together to figure out how we can help in this process going forward beyond 2023.
You're the chair of the trust, correct?
Yes, I am.
And being the chair of the trust, is any oversight currently in place to that trust? Any review of the processes there you can share with us?
Okay, I'm sorry, can you?
You're the chair of the trust.
Yes.
My question is if the Department of Interior is doing an oversight of the trust as we speak.
Right. The way the trust fund is set up, we have 3 members from the U.S. and 2 members from both the RMI.
Do you have a monitor on the trust right now or no?
Oh, do we have a manager? Mm-hmm. Yeah, we hire financial folks that help us on a daily basis. Yeah.
In that experience, I would love it, and I know my time is running, but what detailed assessment of what stays and what may go away if the compact are not renegotiated?
Well, I can say this, the trust funds won't be enough in terms of the funding. Like I said, that is something that we're sort of like discussing how to help. The portfolio itself of the trust funds of both FSM and RMI are sort of diversified based on the markets, but at this point, we hope that it'll work toward that.
And if you can provide it for the record later on, what recommendations specifically for the renewal or the agreements you may ask from this committee? Having said that, I'll yield back.
Thank you.
Thank you. Now recognize, gentlemen.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Chairman. I'm going to have some questions that I would ask the witnesses to respond in writing. I don't have enough time, but let me start. Secretary Shriver, you testified before the Senate Energy and Resources Committee 2 months ago that the administration, quote, strongly supports extending compact financial assistance, end quote. But the source of funding was unanswered at that hearing. Today, you testify again that the administration strongly supports extending compact financial assistance to secure long-term U.S. strategic interests in the region. So in this intervening 2 months, sir, has the administration identified a source of funding?
We don't have a final answer on that, but the work is continued, work with our OMB and our interagency colleagues to identify our proposal that we would bring to the Congress to accomplish that.
Yeah, thank you. That's good because, we would not want to have a repeat of what happened with the Republic of Palau, where it took 7 years to get Congress to approve it. Secretary Oudkirk, I hope I got that right, Sandra. Thank you very much for the visit recently, also for the briefing for one of my meetings. But compact extensions must be enacted into law as we did with the Palau Compact in 2017 with Public Law 115-91. That implies getting congressional buy-in as the compacts are negotiated. Do you agree?
Yes, sir.
So Secretary Pompeo has announced that negotiations are beginning with the Federal States of Micronesia. I hope we can count on the administration to cooperate and communicate fully with the committees as these negotiations progress. May I have your commitment to do that?
Yes, sir. And just to clarify, we have begun consultations. We do not yet have a negotiating mandate.
Thank you. And I know you have a lot on your plate, so any idea who will be conducting these negotiations? And I ask this question because the Palau Compact extension was handled by a State Department career officer, whereas the previous FSM and Marshall's negotiations were handled by special representatives of the President. And this is important because the negotiator must be able to get commitments from other federal agencies like the Postal Service, FEMA, FAA, FDIC. The negotiator has to have clout and must be able to speak for the President, right?
Yes, sir. So right now we are looking. We are in the consultative process. We are working to determine who the negotiator will be. We have not made a determination on that yet, which is why I would draw a distinction between the consultative period that we're in now. We're listening, we're asking questions, we're trying to draw lessons learned. We are not actively negotiating the extension.
But I just, within that lines, I was just making a suggestion. I hope you take that into consideration. A basic element of the 2003 compact was setting up self-sustaining trust funds to replace annual grants. GAO reports that the trust funds are unlikely to meet that goal. So is it going to be one of your goals in negotiating compact renewals to adequately capitalize these trust funds so they can replace the annual grants?
So, Mr. Congressman, just as we are hoping to consult with you and take your advice on how to best configure our negotiating team and what our goals and objectives should be in undertaking this step, which does have a long and far-reaching impact, we're also looking to gain lessons learned from our colleagues at GAO, from colleagues throughout the interagency, and our negotiating partners, the governments of the 3 freely associated states, the people living in those countries, to set objectives and then to negotiate towards a goal that provides the most benefits for the most reasonable cost.
Yeah, so I don't doubt this because, both you and Secretary Shriver have said that you do understand that there are powers at work in the Pacific and that they will step in and offer economic support if the United States gives up the field. So, Secretary Aldrich, how about my time is up, Mr. Chairman.
Without objection, the gentleman will be granted another minute.
Thank you. Very important issue for me, Secretary Aldrich. Special education grant that replaced many federal education programs. That grant was not made a permanent appropriation and has never been full funded. What is your plan for making sure education gets reliable funding when this is when the renegotiation happens? And this is important because, as I always say about the Marianas, and it is true everywhere, education is the key to future prosperity and well-being for the individual and the society. So we have to make sure that education is funded. Would you agree with me on that?
The State Department shares your concern and support for a well-educated population as a foundation for democracy, though I will defer on the specifics of the special education funding to my colleagues from either DOI or GAO, or we can take the question back.
Right. That this should be also a plan in negotiating. Right now, schools in the freely associated states or in the federal states of Micronesia are closed at noon because there's no school meals, and you cannot fully educate or students if you only half day in session. Thank you, and I yield back, Mr. Chairman. I will have questions for the record.
Thank you. I'll now recognize the gentlelady from American Samoa, then I'll recognize myself for questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So this question is for the panel. The administration of the FSM and RMI trusts has been cumbersome and unnecessarily contentious with joint U.S. Insular Management Committees provided for in 2003. The 2010 Palau Compact extension is more efficient, but not less effective with insular ownership and management within U.S. guidelines. Is there any reason not to replicate the Palau model in laws regarding the FSM and RMI? Secretary Shriver.
With your permission, I'll defer to my colleagues who have more direct responsibilities for those matters.
All right, I'll take it. The Palau model is a sinking fund, their trust fund. So it basically kind of ends. The RMI and the FSM model that kicks in after 2023 is hopeful. And I want to emphasize and underline that to be a perpetuity kind of fund. As a matter of fact, I have heard, of course, I could never confirm, that Palau is kind of interested in looking at the models of FSM and RMI in that extent. So right now, the way that the trust funds for the FSM and RMI is set up, once the funding is kicked up, we still, the committees, both trust fund committees in both countries still have to make some decision based on the current law. And some of the changes, I think that the countries would like to do in order to help moving forward after 2023 is part of some of the discussions that we're going to be having with the countries as we move forward.
Secretary Shriver, the RMI is home to the Ronald Reagan Ballistic Missile Defense Test Site on Kwajalein Atoll. When Army General Martin Dempsey, former chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, visited the area, he called Kwajalein the world's premier range and test site for intercontinental ballistic missiles and space operations support, and noted that, quote, "There are a lot of things we do here because of where we're located that we can't do anywhere else in the world." Could you please describe the importance of Kwajalein to the United States?
It's critically important, and I would certainly associate myself with General Dempsey's comment. It has the unique features of that access, but also its geographic location, which does make it ideal for the ballistic missile defense testing if you want to simulate trajectories and where our interceptors would be fired from. It's absolutely ideal. There are other research and development projects that are conducted there, and I mentioned in my opening remarks the work on hypersonics, and there are a number of tests coming up. So it remains a critical facility, which we highly value.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you. Mr. Assistant Secretary, as Ms. Oudkirk testified, we have the right to exclude military action from other states, but they can just call it space or call it something else and say it's not military. China had its space tracking station looking at our missile tests. Do we anticipate China trying to reestablish such a space tracking station, and should we be concerned?
I haven't seen any specific reporting about future intentions, although their ambitions in the space area are quite robust, so I think it's...
But do you think, we do missile testing in the area? Yeah. Is the Department of Defense concerned having the Chinese monitor that from the Marshall, from this territory, the Marshall Islands?
Certainly, any place where they can advantage themselves for that kind of collection, we would be concerned.
So they can do a better job of monitoring than they could from just sending a ship there? Does having a land base enhance their ability?
Potentially. There are technical details.
Please take a look at that.
Yep.
We've talked a lot about the need to fund our efforts. The biggest pot of money is the defense budget. It is much hard. It is, on the one hand, the current system we have has a lot to speak for it, but if it's just about a matter of getting the money, and I'm not talking about changing who does the work, could the Pentagon support the idea that the cost of the freely associated state compacts, et cetera, come in the defense budget?
We're engaged in that discussion internally. I think there are some questions about the expertise for programs such as education and health that we don't have.
Trust me, you'll give the money over to Mr. Pula.
Yeah. Of course, we have a number of programs that do benefit directly the local population. I mentioned the radar facilities in Palau. So
I'm not talking about who spends the money. I'm talking about getting the money for this important service. So I mean, just by way of side, I think the biggest funding for breast cancer research is in the military budget. If you want to do something good for the country or the world, you put it in the military budget. So I hope that you'd continue to pursue the idea that the money would be in the military budget, but it would immediately be transferred to state for what they're doing, to Interior for what they're doing, and of course for what you're doing. This is too important to our national defense to say, well, it was a good idea for our national defense, but we couldn't find any money in the Interior budget, so we didn't do it. Ms. Oudkirk, cryptocurrency is something that the Marshall Islands is looking at. I had a chance to talk last May with President Hina and urge her not to go down that road. I serve on the Financial Services Committee. Our chair has echoed the words of President Trump that this is a very bad road to go down. What is the State Department doing to discourage the Marshall Islands from adopting what is being called a sovereign cryptocurrency?
Sir, with your permission, I will take that question back.
Okay, but if you look at the policy of the government, both on the Democratic side and the president, This is a huge risk to our national security. As important as what the Defense Department does, a lot of our power comes not from his ships, but from our ability to control the world financial payment system. Our sanctions, for example, rest on that, and you should not allow something under an entity that you're coordinating with to undermine that without making it a major concern.
Yes, sir, completely understood. And it's also a very technical issue, and one where the Treasury
It's
Department.
not that technical. You just say it's critical to the United States that the Marshall Islands not go down the road of a sovereign cryptocurrency. We do a lot for you. We're going to do more, especially when we put it in the Defense Department budget. Please don't do this. Finally, climate change. Are we addressing climate change, and what risk does this pose to the FASS?
Sir, I had the honor of accompanying Secretary Bernhardt to the Pacific Island Forum in Tuvalu last month. Climate change was an absolutely top priority for the Pacific Island states there. Secretary Bernhardt was very eloquent in describing all of the work, the U.S. approach to the climate issue, and all of the work that the United States does from NOAA, the Coast Guard, FEMA, and others to deal with the issues of resilience and adaptability. This is an issue that is of absolute importance to our partners in the Pacific, and it's important that we engage with them and explain our approach and the many things and the many programs that we have across the region to work on adaptation and resilience and handling extreme weather, making weather predictions, et cetera.
My time's expiring. I'll simply say that if we emitted less carbon and less methane, perhaps that would help as well. And I'll ask you to respond for the record about Chinese efforts to influence the internal politics of the freely associated states. And with that, we'll recognize, what? Oh, Mr. Yoho, the gentleman from Florida.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate you all being here. You know, since post-World War II, the Indo-Pacific region has been, you know, considered open and free and passable by all. Not until recently have we seen this aggression from China. And it's disturbing to see how aggressively they are. And then through their coercion and intimidation, we see what they're doing with other countries, offering a pot of money with hooks to it, you know, the predatory lending, reminiscent of our robber barons of the 1800s. And what people need to understand, and I think this administration has shown a strong commitment to the Indo-Pacific strategy, you know, with the freedom of navigation that we've done that were postponed and not performed in previous administrations. And is that signal getting out? Are people seeing a difference and they're feeling a little bit more confident? Ms. Shriver?
Certainly, we hear a lot from allies and partners that they welcome our increased presence and our increased freedom of navigation operations. We're also doing, outside the 12 nautical miles, a lot more joint sails and joint patrols with other countries. So again, we get a demand signal and we get statements of appreciation from partners and allies, so I think it is.
Okay, and I've seen other countries step up, as you've seen. I've seen Canada say they're going to, and the UK and all these, and those are all good, positive signals that as a coalition, we are going to make sure that the Indo-Pacific region stays open to trade as it has done. And there's only one aggressor, and that aggressor, is, of course, as we've heard, is China. And people said it is a threat. It's only a threat if you're afraid of it, number one. Number two, if you're unprepared for it. And with the tools this committee passed through last year that the President and the Senate and the President signed into law with the BUILD Act that created the United States International Development Finance Corporation, which is due to roll out in October. Are we identifying projects and letting the people in those areas know that it is different than what the BRI initiative of China has? And Ms. Oudkirk, if you look like you're ready to say something there.
So thank you very much, Congressman. I think I can speak for the entire administration in saying we are delighted that Congress provided us tools through the BUILD Act to enhance our ability to support U.S. business as we put forward a model that competes with that, with the closed, secretive model of China's Belt and Road Initiative. We are looking forward to something called the Indo-Pacific Business Forum, which will be held in early November in Bangkok. That forum, it will be an opportunity.
That's in November, isn't it?
November 4th, yes.
And we have representation there?
Secretary Ross is leading a large trade delegation. You are all welcome to come.
I might be there.
And we'll have other parts of the administration there as well. But that really is going to be the big public opportunity for us to unveil the implementation of the economic side of the Indo-Pacific strategy. So the various alphabet soup, Asia Edge on energy, ITAN on DCCP on telecommunications, ITAN on infrastructure. There's a list of projects. Hopefully, there'll be signings, there'll be deals made. It should be a really good follow-on event to the event that the cabinet secretaries had last summer here in Washington at the U.S. Chamber, where they unveiled the Indo-Pacific.
Okay, let me go ahead and interject here, because you guys are the boots on the ground. You're the ones that are the face of America. You can only do what we do as far as creating tools and use those tools. But I hope the message gets out clear. You know, we talk a lot about the military strategic importance of that area, which it is. It is vital, but more so for an open and free trade area. And then the emphasis needs to really be put on the people of those areas, because that's really the resources that are so important. Yes, it's important militarily and strategically, but it's important for the people of those areas. And that's where we should put our emphasis. And I'm reading your notes, Ms. Oudkirk. You were talking about the amount of tourism that China was going in there, and it boosted their economy up a bunch, but China got upset because they weren't recognized, and so they told everybody don't go there. This is the coercion they're going to use over and over and over again that we don't do, and I hope that message gets out and that you use the tools available. And real quick, am I over? I am over. Nope, I'm still going. Just looking at the wrong red button. One of the other things I wanted to ask you about, and I think this is for you, Mr. Pula, thank you. You were talking about the different trusts, FSM and RMI. Is the other ones, are those sovereign wealth funds? If not, can they be converted to those? And if so, what would you need to, is that something we need to do? Can they be, can we create a vehicle like that? I would sure like to look at that. And then, Ms. Oudkirk, you were talking about there's 3 ambassadors to that area that have those areas have full diplomatic recognition. Others are by the Interior Department, correct? Is there a way that we could strengthen that and have them to have full diplomatic recognition? And you can submit your answer to the record because I'm out of time.
I'll just comment that the United States also, like China, does use our economic power that I hope is not undermined by Marshall Islands sovereign cryptocurrency. Gentleman who has been here from the very beginning, further from me geographically in this room and from the area, but he's been here from the beginning, the gentleman from California.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Yeah, I agree with a lot of what my colleague from Florida just talked about. And I think the issue of maritime sovereignty, maritime strength, the issue of Taiwan having visited multiple times is absolutely bipartisan and reflects the values of the United States in terms of freedom of democracy, freedom of choice, free markets. Obviously, I think many of us on this committee have been very concerned with China's overreach and lack of respect for that maritime sovereignty and rule of law, and certainly was critical of the Obama administration in their lateness in acting on the South China Sea. But I also applauded their decision to start the freedom of navigation operations as well. Assistant Secretary Shriver, under your leadership, the U.S. has increased the pace of those operations But at this juncture, what I think many of us feared was China establishing that foothold in the South China Sea and gaining some confidence in that. As they start to think about the second island chain and so forth, how do you think this changes the calculus from the Chinese perspective, given where they were with the first?
I suspect they're evaluating our response, our actions, and those of other partners based on what they did with the build-out of the outposts in the South China Sea, the deployment of military systems, and now seeing how countries are reacting to that. First and foremost, the United States. We have increased freedom of navigation. We have more joint patrols, joint sails with other countries. We're increasing our capacity building. Another program we have to help assist countries in maritime Southeast Asia is the Maritime Security Initiative, where we help with their ability to sense and see and contribute to maritime security. So I hope what they see is a response that is really counterproductive to what China's ultimate aims are. They'd be far better off pursuing their interests through peaceful means and allowing that area to remain free and open and not try to change the qualitative nature of it, because we're open to having a free and open Indo-Pacific that benefits all, including China. But if one country tries to change international law, then we'll get a strong response.
Well, thank you for that update. Certainly there's a lot of support, and I think, I can't speak for every member of this committee or this body, but I think most of us, if I listen to the comments, fully support that increased presence and sending that signal to China that they can have a prosperous future as well, but you've got to have the rule of law and the rule of the open seas. Either Assistant Secretary Shriver or Ms. Oderkirk could answer this next question. We have a close relationship with other nations who play a major role in supporting the freely associated states. Australia and New Zealand are part of our Five Eyes, our closest relations, but Japan also has a relationship. And I'd just be curious if you could give us an update on how Australia, New Zealand, Japan are also supporting the freely associated states.
So I will take the non-military aspects of that. So we work very closely with development partners, and I would say Australia, New Zealand, Japan, India increasingly has shown an interest, and Taiwan for its diplomatic partners. And we work to ensure that our assistance programs, whether they are on the soft side, training programs, or on the more delivery of assistance, are coordinated, that they don't duplicate, that they don't create gaps. This is an effort that we have broadly across the Pacific in support of the various strategies, our Indo-Pacific strategy, the Australian Pacific Step Up, and so that's something that is ongoing, and it's the subject of constant diplomatic engagement.
Great.
If I could just add briefly, Secretary Esper took his first trip as confirmed secretary to the Indo-Pacific, and he included Australia and New Zealand. First Secretary of Defense visit to New Zealand since 2011. It was not only to invest in that relationship that's important, but it was to talk about the Oceania region. As my colleague mentioned, Australia has a step-up program. New Zealand has the reset. So we're talking about how we can be partners together in protecting the sovereignty and increasing capacity in this area. On the DoD side, we have specific projects throughout the Pacific Island region. There's work going on in the PNG that we're doing with the Australians about a particular base. There's work in Fiji where the Australians have worked on the peacekeeping training facility, and we're doing the training. So it's expansive throughout the region, and it's really a way to leverage the like-minded nature of those close alliances.
Great. Well, thank you for that. And again, for the Chinese that would be watching this, this is an important region.
Now recognize the gentleman from Tennessee.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, members. This area actually holds a little bit of history in my family. My father was in the United States Marine Corps and fought on the island of Peleliu, so some of these islands are, he and my mom are both in heaven, but they were wonderful people. And Daddy went back for the 50th anniversary of the invasion of Peleliu, and they treated him like royalty, and it was in one of his fondest memories. And I remember my mama was there for about 30 minutes, and she slipped on some coral and busted her head open, and my dad made a joke about how that he was there for, I think, 20-something days in combat and never got a scratch, and Mama was there 30 minutes, and she got a Purple Heart. So, and the Navy surgeon, actually, after my mom and daddy both died, I was going through some stuff, and the Navy surgeon actually wrote my parents a very nice letter, just how memorable it was. So, I and Daddy, one of the greatest, I guess, disappointments of his life was after the war, they went to China, actually, and were escorting the Japanese soldiers off the island because the Chinese were killing them. But Daddy had a real love for the Chinese folks, and he hated the fact that we, in his words, we turned them over to the communists. And he said they could have been one of our greatest allies, and we blew that. But anyway, and my question really has to do with if China tried to coerce any of the freely associated states, the FAS, to switch their diplomatic relations from Taiwan to mainland China, could our defense veto or the right of strategic denial prevent this? And I answer, if any of y'all could answer that, that would be fine. And thank y'all so much.
Okay, thank you very much, Congressman. I'll address the issue of sort of Taiwan's diplomatic partners. So we were very disappointed in the decisions of the governments of the Solomon Islands and of Kiribati last week to switch recognition. We do believe that, as I said earlier, that the status quo situation across the straits is a situation that has enabled peace and prosperity in the region for decades. We believe that countries who choose to recognize China in the hopes that it will provide economic benefits or concessionary loans ultimately will be disappointed, as have many other countries who've taken out those loans for other reasons once they realize the terms of the loan. I think when we look at China's Belt and Road Initiative, we see that it is a program by China for China. And kind of to answer a little bit of the question that I got earlier, the wonderful thing about U.S. deals and U.S. investment around the world is that investment is led by U.S. companies. It is made on commercial terms. We deeply appreciate the support that Congress has given us through the BUILD Act and other economic tools that will help us support our private sector, but at the end of the day, it is the private sector that needs to lead, and that is what makes us different from China.
Any others want to comment on that? Okay.
Certainly agree that we're disappointed by the decision that those countries made. I think we underscore the unique aspects of our defense relationship with the freely associated states, so that there might be even additional costs if they were to make a similar choice, but they're certainly under pressure. And so one of the reasons we at the Defense Department talk about the economic aspects of our compact, seemingly an economic issue, not a defense issue, is that it's really the comprehensive relationship that keeps them, I think, more aligned with us on a range of things, to include the security challenges associated with China.
Well, thank y'all very much, and I hope that we can, a lot of lives were lost to secure that security, and although it's mainly on the History Channel now, it lives in me, and you know, my daddy never, as I stated, he never got a scratch hardly. His were all internal. As a little boy, I can remember, even till the day he died, when I'd wake him up, I would never go over the top of him. I'd grab him by his toe, because I really didn't know where he was when he woke up. And he was an incredible human being. And so thank y'all so much for what you do. Thank you.
I'd point out to the committee that I'm working on legislation to try to identify China debt trap debt instruments and encourage countries to simply not repay without hurting their international credit rating. With that, I'll recognize the gentlelady from Pennsylvania who's been here the longest in this room, if not the longest in Congress,
No, not so long.
for 5 minutes.
Thank you. I appreciate it. And it's nice to see you again, Assistant Secretary Shriver. My first question is for you and Mr. Pula as well. We talked a little bit about climate change, and I was wondering if you might, or anybody, comment on the implications possibly on the migration of people and whether or not that has any implications to national security and also to trade as well. I'm particularly interested in if people are leaving, what sort of void does that leave behind in terms of national security and also trade?
Thank you. We at the Department of Defense have cited climate change as and the impact as having a national security impact, and that's true in the region of the Pacific Islands and the freely associated states. Most of our efforts are on shoring up the resiliency of our facilities there, like the facility we spoke about at Kwajalein. The issues associated with migration in the freely associated states are unique because of their ability to travel to the United States. But potentially, migration could leave both access opportunities for adversaries, and it could lead to other humanitarian situations where Department of Defense has a supporting role. So it is something, again, we've reported on and been very public about our concerns, and we do have a role in responding to that.
Mr. Pula.
Thank you for the question. On the climate change, I had the privilege to accompany Secretary Zinke last year to the Pacific Island Forum in Nauru. And as we all know, the small island nations in the Pacifics are very big in the climate change issue. I recall correctly Secretary Zinke's point to the reporters when the questions of climate change was asked, where he said the United States has been doing its part in terms of lowering, working on the climate change. They might want to ask those questions to China and other countries. So I think with this administration, they've been working hard on resiliency and all that as we engage also with the folks in the freely associated states, as well as our other friends in the Pacific Islands countries. With the migration part, again, just yesterday on my way back from Honolulu, I sat next to a 3-year-old and mother on the plane from Chuuk. We were coming to Nevada. I was talking to the mother, and they said, I was surprised. They said, well, they're on their way to Denver to visit some families. I guess the point I'm trying to make is with folks from the freely associated states traveling to the United States, some of whom live here, some of them go back in the migration, but connecting with the climate change issue, I think with the Marshall Islands, and the president of the Marshall Islands have spoken at the UN and other areas because of the low-lying atolls. These are issues that the administration are aware of, and we've been dealing with as much as we can, and as we speak to our friends and colleagues from FAS.
And some of the legislation that I helped put forward actually has to do with asking our State Department to be more involved in helping other nations to meet their Paris Climate Accord agreements as well. And so it's critical, this issue of climate change, and I do believe it has implications to national security in that particular area of the world. I only have a minute left, but I was wondering, I know Mr. Pritchett talked a little bit about the issues of Belt and Road. You all talked about that as well. Can you specifically speak to Vanuatu and Samoa in terms of the concern, if any, that you have in terms of China coming in for developing a port, and whether or not we are doing the right things and enough things to invest in that area? I only have about a minute left.
Starting with the port, there's been public reporting on the Chinese involvement in building out a port in Vanuatu. Interestingly, there was public backlash in Vanuatu about the suspicions that the port and the pier in particular would be used not just for commercial purposes, but to potentially host military vessels. So that backlash led to clarifications from the government there that they are for commercial purposes, but that can change in the future, so we are concerned about that. I think we are engaging Vanuatu in ways to demonstrate that we can be a preferred security partner. I traveled there with an interagency team, including Coast Guard colleagues, who talked about their law enforcement needs and the interest in protecting their sovereign territorial waters from illegal, illicit activity. And so we're trying to use the tools available to us to show that we can be the preferred partner.
Thank you. I've run out of time. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I'd like to start out by following up on your comments about our new Pacific Islands caucus, which is a first-ever congressional caucus focused on the Pacific Islands, roughly 24 jurisdictions across the entirety of the Pacific Islands that are all integral to the future, not only the Pacific, but the Indo-Pacific and our country. And so we welcome the community here and all those listening.
If the gentleman will yield, I want to praise you for coming up with the idea and getting us organized and creating that caucus. I yield back.
Well, thank you very much. The members on the dais, most of us are members, and all of us are very interested in this. So we welcome your suggestions on how to fully engage on these subjects with Congress. This is to the three members of the administration here. We've got three separate departments here. I support the compacts. I support our relationship on a number of levels, whether you want to talk about trust responsibilities that go back generations to shared support of friends with shared values to our military aspects of mutual defense. However, the impact of the compacts thus far on specific jurisdictions in our country are not acceptable anymore. And I speak primarily of the locations where the compact migrants come to. These are Guam, these are CNMI to some extent, certainly Hawaii, and not just restricted to those. For example, Arkansas has a large compact population. And there is virtually no compensation to us for the price of welcoming those migrants to our jurisdictions. We welcome them. We have an incredibly strong and growing community of compact country migrants in Hawaii, maybe 20,000, somewhere in that range when you count those that have become American citizens. However, the cost to Hawaii is probably somewhere around $300 million plus today. That's a state expense, a state expense. The GAO is studying this right now, correct? You are engaged in a study commission by the Senate, which I strongly support, to actually update the calculations, which at FY15 were roughly $148 million for Hawaii in the areas of health and education, but also other areas. Now, we just cannot accept that anymore because I suspect that cost is going to accelerate because we are going to have an increasing number of migrants from the compact countries if the compacts continue, as I hope they do. And the cost per person is probably going to accelerate too. So the attitude and the response, and I was here in Congress the last time the compact came to Congress for approval. And I regret that we didn't make more of an issue of it at the time. At the time, we sought to double the compact impact aid paid from, I think it was $15 million to $30 million, which was nothing. Now, we view our obligation as accepting the compact migrants. However, the attitude of the administration was, we will negotiate the compacts, and the actual impact on the rest of the country and specific jurisdictions like Hawaii is not our business. We're just going to negotiate the compacts. And I'm saying it is your business. I'm asking you to acknowledge that this is your business, and I hope that you will strongly, as you get into these negotiations, for all of the jurisdictions that bear a disproportionate result from the migrants, that you will make that your business and not just say, well, Congress, we negotiated these here are the compacts for approval, and by the way, it's up to you to determine how to fund the compact impact. So it's not going to be okay with me, I can tell you that, and I think that's probably true of other members that represent these jurisdictions. So I don't need a response from you, but I'm just telling you, this is your business. I hope you will deal with it. Let's see, I want to talk briefly about the interchange having to do with the State Department, Ms. Oudkirk. I had a very interesting interchange with journalists from the Pacific Islands. It was a program put on by the East-West Center, which is one of our preeminent institutions located in Honolulu that outreaches to the Indo-Pacific.
invaluable to our relationships. And these journalists came in to talk with me freely off the record. We had a great discussion. They were all from their countries. And I asked them, you know, what is the one thing that we can actually do to strengthen our relationships? And they basically said, it's about relationships, personal relationships. And their perception, almost to a person, and these are people from across the Indo-Pacific, all felt that basically China was out-personalizing us in this department. Now, it strikes me that, yes, of course we have a diplomatic presence, but I'd be curious to see what that diplomatic presence has looked like in terms of a trend over the last 10 or 20 years. I hope it's been going up, but probably not. And what also strikes me is that a lot of our soft power outreach is now borne by the Department of Defense. They do a great job in many of these areas, but they shouldn't be doing that. It really should be state that's doing this. So I would simply leave you with that comment, that there is a significant perception, at least, that in terms of the development of relationships, we're not doing a good job. Thank you.
Thank you. I'll now recognize the gentleman from Guam.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm going to echo some of the sentiments from my colleague from Hawaii, but maybe be a little bit more pointed in so doing. Mr. Pula, in your response to my chairman on the Natural Resources Committee, when you said that it depends in terms of who you ask with respect to whether or not the U.S. investment into the FAS states was sufficient for them to be able to reach a level of self-sufficiency, I don't think it depends on who you ask. I think it's blatantly obvious that it's been an abject failure. Not only has the corpus of the trust not grown to a level to meet the need of the funding, not only has the grants and technical assistance been sufficient for the areas to be able to reach a level of self-sufficiency, not to rely on those fundings, but both of those funding levels have not even factored in the inordinate amount of subsidy that is provided by the host regions, to include the territories, the state of Hawaii, and the others that was mentioned by my colleague. If we had not hosted this level of migration, the corpus and the trust fund and its growth would be even more underwater, and the grants that they're receiving would be even less sufficient. So I don't think there's any debate as to whether or not the compact relationship was sufficient or not for these areas to be able to reach a level of independence. I think it's very, very obvious that it hasn't. On Guam, the population of the FAS residents is more than 2 out of the 4 states that comprise the FSM. It's over 50% of the entire population of the Republic of Palau, and it's over 50% of the entire population on the island of Majuro, that is the largest atoll in the Republic of the Marshall Islands. And so the subsidy that's being provided, at least just from Guam, for the compacts and their lack of ability to be able to make up for whatever these areas are needing is enormous. Not only does the population of the FAS make up almost 10% of the population on Guam, but the compact impact fundings that Guam receives is less than 2% of what its overall budget is for its annual fiscal year operations. We get less than 2% of the funding in compact impact for our budget, and our population on the FAS is nearly 10%. So the subsidy is enormous. And we need to factor all those things when we're looking at this on an equal basis. Part of the way for us to be able to move away from the need for subsidy in terms of whether it's being done in host areas or if it's going to be absorbed by more trust funds is to ensure the areas are able to develop to a level that they're not going to be having their population move to areas to get subsidized. And it's also to be able to ensure level of developments that we're not relying on trust fund monies to subsidize the lack of development. But development is grossly lacking in these areas, and I would like to argue due in large part to our inability to necessarily expend the resources that are provided in a way that's going to facilitate that development. And so I wanted to ask specifically about the Joint Economic Management Committee and the Joint Economic Management and Financial Accountability Committee. These 2 committees are responsible for administering the grants that are provided to the FSM and the RMI. With respect to all the grants that have been provided, is there a balance that's basically unexpended in GEMCO and GEMFAC? Mr. Pula?
Thank you, Congressman, for the question. Yes, there are balances. It's the funding that we provide.
What's the total value of the balances right now?
Well, let me say this. We'll get that information to you. I can't get it off the top of my head.
Just an estimate, the balances in GEMCO that have been unexpended in terms of grants?
Well, for the FSM, because of the infrastructure slowness of how it went for the FSM, it's, I would say it's over $100 million.
Over $100 million in unexpended grants that are supposed to help these areas to develop. How about in GEMFAC?
I would say a few millions dollars, not as much, and those are the unused by the sector grants. Like not spent totally because it's on an annual basis.
If we want to reduce the amount of dependence of these areas, we need to make sure the funding that we're providing to be able to make them more self-sufficient is actually being deployed in order to encourage that self-sufficiency. Secretary Shriver, I just wanted to ask real quick, does the Indo-PACOM strategy factor in a status quo relationship with the FAS?
If I understand the question, it does assume we will continue with that status of freely associated states and compacts. If that status were to change, Indo-Pacific Command would adapt.
And just to close, Mr. Chairman, the need for us to make sure we get the grant deployment right and the need for us to make sure we get these funding levels right is because if we don't and the ground changes out there and we have a change in whether or not China is involved or what have you, is going to cost us exorbitantly more in the adjustments that Indo-PACOM is going to have to make in order to compensate for that. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
And last, but certainly not least, the lady from Virginia.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to our witnesses who are here today. This week at the UN General Assembly, President Hilda Heine of the Republic of the Marshall Islands emphasized that her country could be one of the first to see large-scale migration as a result of rising sea levels. I understand the freely associated states all view climate change and sea level change as an existential threat. And my question is, what impact in your view, is this likely to have on the security and the stability of the region? And what are your departments doing to plan for these challenges of anticipated large-scale migration? And what do we see as the threat or the challenge facing the United States as a result of this regional change and challenge? And I'll open it up to all of our witnesses.
Thank you. I'll just address the security aspect. We have identified in Department of Defense public reporting that climate change and its impact is a national security threat, and that we have a role in addressing that. Primarily, we look at the resiliency of our facilities, protection of our facilities, and we would certainly put the Reagan ballistic missile test facility at the top of that list. Yep. I think beyond that, if we get into different scenarios of how migration could occur, and we've already spoken about the unique status that allows these citizens to come to the United States, but there could be potential other humanitarian situations where the Department of Defense would be involved in a supporting role, logistics, response, et cetera. But it is something that we've identified as a concern.
Thank you very much. Ms. Oudkirk?
Great. So the United States recognizes that addressing environmental degradation and climate change is a priority for the Pacific Island states, including the freely associated states. And this is because of the threat of sea level rise and the region's extreme vulnerability to natural disasters. So the State Department works with interagency partners to support a variety of programs that provide resilience and adaptation in the Pacific Islands. This ranges from improving drinking water quality and wastewater management to support weather forecasting infrastructure, to improve early warning and disaster resilience and response, and then, of course, in the case of a natural disaster, to provide the immediate recovery and response assistance through the Office of Foreign Disaster Assistance.
Okay.
So this year, the U.S. government pledged $36.5 million in new foreign assistance to the Pacific Islands. Much of that was concentrated in programs that broadly address environmental, climate, fisheries-related issues. And we're committed to continuing to work. We talked earlier about other development partners, working with development partners and bilaterally to address these challenges.
So I appreciate the focus on some of the preventative things that we are doing to ensure that we're mitigating challenges, but if we are working towards a place where this threat is recognized as the threat of sea level change will lead to large-scale migration. Specific to the challenge potentially of large-scale migration, do you have any comments on what we as a country have been doing to either help with that threat and then how it might impact us?
I defer to DOI on migration because of the unique FAS relationship.
Thank you.
I don't want to take that question. Congresswoman, thank you. But I do want to come back just a little bit to my friends, congressmen from Hawaii and also from Guam, regarding the compact impact. I know that's...
As it relates to migration?
Yeah, migration. And because, you know, a few years back, Governor Abercrombie, I went over there to Honolulu, gave him a $10 million check. He looked at me, he threw it on the ground and said, Nick, this is not enough for what the state of Hawaii give out. So I am well aware of the brunt and for years now since the compact. The migration part, because of its, you know, allowable in the compact for the folks in FAS to travel freely without visa, they do come and go back. You know, they don't always come and just stay. But as population grows, there are some areas, of course, their population is kind of decreasing because of their coming, and I think a lot of them are coming not necessarily because of climate change, but because of seeking for a better future, schools and jobs and whatnot. But as far, in our department, we try to do our best with technical assistance whenever our friends from the Freely Associated ask for things. For example, we fund quite a bit of outside islands of the Marshall Islands, this reverse osmosis kind of things to help with the flooding, sea level, and all that. But, you know, primarily, of course, the issue, as we all know, is much bigger than we all try to handle.
Thank you for your answers. I am out of time. I yield back.
Thank you. I want to thank this panel for joining us. We'll now impanel the next panel, consisting of the ambassadors from the Marshall Islands and the Federated States of Micronesia. And while people are standing up and sitting down, I will put in a plug for a hearing of the Asia and Pacific Subcommittee in the 4th week of October. We're going to focus on human rights in South Asia, and those concerned with the Indo-Pacific region, I think will find that interesting. There's been a lot of interest in human rights in South Asia. I know Mr. Cox, and people may think I'm skipping the gentleman from California. I've been informed that he did not want to ask questions of the first panel. If I'm wrong, I'll bring him back. Okay. So we will concentrate on human rights in South Asia after we return from this recess. I will now turn over the chair to Kilili Sablan, the gentleman from the Northern Marianas Islands, who, on behalf of the Natural Resources Committee, will chair the portion of this hearing with the second panel. Thank you.
Usually in Congress, we all want a chair. You don't want a chair. No. Look at that. Okay. Don't fall down.
And thank you, and good afternoon, everyone. That was a good hearing. I actually had over a dozen questions that I couldn't ask, but I will ask for the record. At this time, I'd like to recognize and welcome His Excellency Gerald M. Zacchaeus, Ambassador to the United States from the Republic of the Marshall Islands, Yoge. and of course, His Excellency Aquilino Susaya, Ambassador to the United States from the Federated States of Micronesia, Kasilelemai, right? Or Rananim. And I'd start with Ambassador Zacchius. Please, you have 5 minutes, and that light turns green. When it starts, it goes orange, you have a minute remaining, and when it goes red, of course, your 5 minutes is up. Please. Thank you.
Chairman Sablan, distinguished leaders and members of the committees, thank you for this meeting. It is very timely. President Heine would have been here if she could, but matters of state required her attention. She conveys her warm yakwe and appreciation to the committees. Since you have our full statement, I'm going to highlight its key points. The first is that during the years of U.S. administration on our islands, we came to feel, as President Reagan promised in advocating for compacts of free association, you will always be family to us. We are proud to enable U.S. control over a strategic expanse of the Pacific larger than Texas, including shipping lanes coveted by other nations, to be the location of what the Joint Chiefs have described as the world's premier range and test site for ICBMs and space operations, to be a UN member, second only to Israel in voting with the United States, and to have a higher rate of enlistment in the U.S. military than most U.S. states. The Trump administration and many in Congress from both parties want to continue our free association long beyond 2023. The RMI's current government does too. The biggest potential threat comes from the financial influence of China, as has been shown in other Pacific islands. For example, our government was challenged by a Chinese proposal to build a port and 1,000 homes on Rongelap in return for its autonomy from our government. A pivotal issue is that the trust fund established by the 2003 Compact, amendments to replace annual U.S. grant assistance after FY23 won't have enough money despite good returns. It is critical that the trust fund be capitalized so that it can accomplish its purpose. As matters stand now, our nation will experience severe economic shocks and shortfalls in funding for critical priority compact sectors of health and education. If not done by FY24, this certainly can be done over a 20-year compact extension. A first step can be taken by the U.S. making the contributions it pledged in both its 1986 and 2003 compact laws. $20 million was to be provided if it could substantiate economic losses due to the U.S. nullifying tax and trade provisions of the compact after it was signed. We have. The first reaction of some in the RMI to the announcement of compact extension negotiations was to recall this unfulfilled commitment. The 2003 amendments replaced many U.S. education programs with a supplemental education grant. The $6.1 million a year index for inflation has never been provided. It is now $5.5 million worth less. The grant should be a permanent appropriation, as is other compact assistance. Current federal programs and services agreement also need to be continued, such as the Postal Service, FEMA, Weather Services, Federal Aviation Authority programs, and special education programs and Pell Grants. The RMI can't replace them. There are other issues for negotiations that are of immediate priority concern. The preeminent one is the source of funding. It wasn't worked out for Palau Compact extension until 7 years after the 2010 agreement. The budget baselines needs to be addressed. Additionally, many agencies operate in the RMI, some unique and requiring special funding. The negotiations need to be conducted on the U.S. side in a way that will bring all involved seriously to the table and appreciative of the importance of their programs. The compacts were negotiated by ambassadors representing the U.S. President. Special representatives at the State Department renegotiated the 2003 compact extensions. The Palau extension model of regular State Department officers negotiating was insufficient. Finally, I must note a concern the compact does not address and cannot effectively address, but must concern us all. the rising ocean is an existential threat that can reduce the size of our nation and totally wipe it off the map. Thank you for this opportunity to discuss our concerns, and I am happy to answer any questions.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Jacquias. And now my friend, Ambassador Susaya. Please, you have 5 minutes, sir.
Thank you, Chairman, ranking members, distinguished members of the committees. Thank you for convening this joint hearing and for the opportunity to testify before you today. I have submitted to the committees copies of my full written statement, so I wish to summarize the key points of this statement for the purpose of this hearing. The United States is and has been the closest friend and ally of the Federated States of Micronesia as the FSM continues to grow and flourish as a young nation. The U.S. and the FSM have done much in recent months to acknowledge and celebrate the special relationship between our two countries. In May, our newly elected president, David W. Panuelo, came to Washington to meet with President Donald Trump and several cabinet secretaries. That visit reinforced the fact we have no greater friend in the world than the United States, and the United States respects and values the relationship it has with the FSM. We were then delighted to host two cabinet officials, Secretary of Veterans Affairs Robert Wilkie and Secretary of State Mike Pompeo. This was the first time our nation has been accorded such opportunities in our young history. The U.S. and the FSM have a long-standing strategic partnership that reflects the common values of our two countries, including our commitment to promoting sovereignty, the rule of law, democracy, and regional security. In 1986, the FSM and the United States entered the Compact of Free Association. The 1986 Compact was renewed and amended with the entry into force of the 2003 amended Compact of Free Association, which remains in effect today. Under these compacts, the FSM has continuously granted the U.S. security and defense rights in the territory of the FSM. FSM citizens have the right to live, work, and study in the United States without a visa. Under the 2003 amended compact, the United States committed to provide certain key financial assistance through fiscal year 2023 and to provide U.S. federal programs and services in the FSM. The Federated States of Micronesia is fully committed to its relationship with the United States, which contributes to the strength and prosperity of both our nations. We look forward to being a part of the United States' enhanced effort to promote a free and open Indo-Pacific and to advance our defense partnership even further. While the defense and immigration provisions in the amended compact will continue after 2023, ensuring the continued strength of our partnership, certain financial assistance provisions of the amended compact will expire after fiscal year 2023. These provisions include federal programs and services, supplemental education grants, and sector grants. U.S. contributions to the U.S. FSM Compact Trust Fund are also set to expire. This financial assistance is a central pillar of our strong relationship and has further strengthened the bonds between our two countries. We were pleased to hear Secretary Pompeo's announcement last month in Pompeii that the U.S. is prepared to work with the FSM on an extension of this support beyond fiscal year 2023. We look forward to starting these negotiations with the U.S. very soon. The potential end of this financial assistance has created uncertainty for our government and our people. These discussions and the decisions that will result will allow us to remove that uncertainty and move forward most effectively with our strategic partnership with the United States. In preparation for these discussions, the FSM has established a joint committee on compact review and planning that will be responsible for negotiating with the United States. Recently, the committee announced the appointment of the chief negotiator.
In response, the FSM is still awaiting further information from the U.S. on the proposed schedule for beginning discussions. To conclude, Chairman and members of the committees, the FSM government appreciates the House Natural Resources and Foreign Affairs' long-standing commitment to the enduring partnership between the U.S. and the FSM. Although the year 2023 may seem distant now, there is much work to be done that will require coordinated efforts among the various parts of the FSM government and both the executive and legislative branches of the U.S. government. Given the number of issues to be addressed and the great importance of these issues to both of our countries, we believe that this work should begin as soon as possible. We look forward to keeping the committees informed of significant developments as this process moves forward. We hope that these negotiations can serve as an opportunity for the U.S. and the FSM to reaffirm our unique friendship and strong partnership and our mutual commitment to promoting security and stability in the Indo-Pacific region. Thank you, Chairman, for holding this hearing on this important topic.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Ambassador. At this time, I would yield to the gentleman from Guam, Mr. San Nicolas, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ambassador Zakios and Ambassador Salcea, very nice to see you, my friends. Yokwe Kasilelia, Sijus Maasi for making the time to be with us here today and for all of your advocacy for the region that I know is a very difficult task that you undertake with all of your hearts. Mr. Chairman, I think that the implementation negotiation that we're talking about here today needs to move beyond a continuation discussion, and it needs to include opportunities for our FAS allies to really strengthen to an American standard. When we shortchange the FAS, that is an ultimate reflection of the United States' commitment to its allies, and really, you are the only freely associated allies we have. You know, it is an actual step above almost all of the other diplomatic relationships we have throughout the globe. And so if our freely associated allies are not a reflection of American excellence, then how can we go out as America and truly make the case that embodying American excellence is something that's going to be worthwhile? I think we need to really understand that, and we need to make a commitment to that. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I'd like to put on the record certain things that I believe we need to consider to include in this implementation agreement in order for our allies to be able to have access to some of the most robust programs that this country has to offer. First of all, Mr. Chairman, we need to make sure that we include the ability for our FAS allies to have access to capital the same way that U.S. territories are able to access that capital. Right now, U.S. territory is able to go out into the bond market and is able to float a triple tax exempt debt that they can use for development. Right now, our FAS allies are stuck in the international bond market, which has exorbitant interest rates compared to what you'd be able to get for a triple tax exempt bond in our domestic markets. Being able to extend access to our domestic markets to our FAS allies would grant them the ability to finance dramatic infrastructure projects that could be life-altering for the people and for the economy of the FAS. They can build schools, they can build hospitals, they can build roads, they can expand their airports, they can grow and develop so they're not dependent on grants and not even dependent on interest from a trust fund. Secondly, Mr. Chairman, we need to look into making sure that our FAS citizens are able to access something that all of the other administered areas under the Department of Interior are able to access, and that's Medicaid. If you live in a territory and you're administered by the Department of Interior, your citizens are able to access Medicaid. If you are a Native American, your tribal government, you're still able to access Medicaid. FAS citizens are the only citizens that are under an administering relationship with the Department of Interior that are not able to access Medicaid. Accessing Medicaid won't just be the extension of a benefit to the freely associated states. It would actually help the host areas in terms of being able to take on the cost of the hosting. On Guam, we're not able to extend Medicaid to freely associated citizens. In Hawaii, they're not able to extend Medicaid to freely associated citizens. So the cost of subsidizing the health care for these citizens is borne at a rate that we're not able to access as if they were full citizens of the United States. So when we have GEMCO and JAMFAC underinvesting in health care in the freely associated states, and we have their citizens moving to host areas in order to get that health care, they're coming in and they're being subsidized at the full cost of of somebody who actually isn't able to access Medicaid. So being able to extend that program will not only help the host areas, but if we can also extend that program into the FAS, perhaps even considering reprogramming grant funding that is sitting in GEMCO and sitting in JAMFAC and having it be used for matching funds for Medicaid, that could actually not only help to fund the healthcare needs of the areas, but it would provide a base level of funding to be able to bring in new service providers and new investment, so we have a less need for migration out for the purposes of healthcare. Mr. Chairman, I wanted to put my friends on the record, particularly with GEMCO and JAMFAC, because I believe that that is a reflection of underutilization of existing resources. And I think that we really need to talk about why we're not using the resources that are already provided in order for us to be able to meet the needs of our allies in the freely associated states. So I'll go ahead and start with you, Ambassador Sosea, if I may. Can you elaborate on the amount of funds that is sitting in GEMCO and what the FSM believes is not only the reason for that money sitting there, but the impact for not being able to access those grants?
Thank you, Chairman. Thank you, Congressman San Nicolas. I heard the answer from Director Bula when you asked the same question to him. I know that we have challenges too in our country, FSM, in terms of utilizing the infrastructure funds, mainly the infrastructure funds. Because of several issues, like in some of our states, the government doesn't have eminent domain to lands on which some of these projects are supposed to be built, like schools, dispensaries, and all that. So that is contributing to the delay. But on the other hand, the conditions and the restrictions that are placed by the compact or the fiscal procedures agreement, the subsidiary agreement in the compact, is also contributing to the delay and the backlog of the use of these funds. For instance, the bonding requirements for projects, construction projects, is very prohibitive for companies, local companies in the FSM to bid for these projects. So we end up advertising for companies to come in from Guam or Honolulu or California, and the amount of these projects are not that huge in terms of these companies' profit. So the delay is always finding companies to bid for these projects. So those are, to me, I think those are the bottlenecks that we're facing in terms of implementing these infrastructure funds.
Yeah, Ambassador, thank you. If my colleagues would agree, we may have a second round of questions, but the Guam Congressman's time is up. I would like to ask unanimous consent. There's 4 of us here. Dr. Goodnick is still in the room. If we could, does anybody have any objection to Dr. Goodnick joining the panel? Do you have any objection, Dr. Goodnick, to coming in and joining the panel?
He may regret it. He may regret it, but
You're more than welcome, but you don't have to. But you know how important you are here, Dr. Goodnick. And so, thank you. Thank you. Dr. Goodnick is seated as a member, participant in panel 2. And at this time, I recognize my friend and distinguished Resident Commissioner from Puerto Rico, Ms. Gonzalez-Colon, for 5 minutes.
thank you, Mr. Chairman. I would like to introduce for the record the statements of Ranking Member Michael McCall from Foreign Affairs.
Without objection.
Thank you. And first of all, I want to say thank you and welcome the ambassadors. I know it's a long way coming here to D.C. and manage all these issues. I was reviewing the General Accounting Office report on the fund, on the trust funds, and how those funds are distributed. And one of the questions we did to the Department of Interior was in terms of if there's any oversight. There are many recommendations regarding the policies that are going to be implemented, the fiscal changes that may be happening in those funds. My questions to you and to this panel will be in terms of what changes specifically do you understand should be addressed to have, more opportunity to use those funds? Because everybody's talking about making changes. What kind of changes specifically are you seeking, if any? Zacchaeus?
Thank you, Congressman, woman, for the question. I think the first thing that we feel is important to consider post-2023 is the FPA. And we feel that the distribution policy that currently is in the FPA that addresses use of resources from the trust fund needs to be revisited. We see, and I understand from the earlier questions about management, FPA as it applies to grants and programs under current agreement does not necessarily under the compact apply to the trust funds. So I think we need to address that issue. I would end my answer here by saying that in talking about the issue of a trust fund, I think fiscal responsibility does not necessarily translate to micromanagement. I think these are independent countries, and I think we could work together to make sure that resources that are provided are put to good use without the burdens of micromanagement that will stifle a lot of the efforts that we're trying to achieve from these resources to help these countries. Thank you.
Ambassador.
Yes, for the FSM, I think the fact remains that the forecast, the projected revenue that was initially made is insufficient. So it's not so much to change the wording of the comeback per how to utilize the trust fund proceeds. It's really the fact that the return on the investment to date is not sufficient to to replace the sector crimes. So it is our hope that if we can extend the term of the comeback and continue to receive the same level of funding or whatever, a bit more to build up the corpus so that eventually we will have our budgetary reserve lines to take care of these sector crimes.
Can you describe, both of you, describe the practices you've been doing in your nations in order to have or increase budgetary and economic self-reliance during the last years, and how those two islands may be impacted if there's no negotiation of a new agreement? I mean, what services are going to be impacted directly, immediately, if you don't have a new compact?
In addition to most of the sectors, Congressman, that would be mostly affected, health and education are key sectors that will be really affected by these. So the continuation of the extended provisions is very important, as I've cited, and the funding of the trust fund so that it can address this. To your point of what we have done, the Marshall Islands has invested its own resources into the trust fund, $30+ million. When it started, when the compact was initiated, we put $30 million, and then that plus additional. We have also gone out, as required by the compact, to find subsequent contributors. So the Marshall Islands had engaged Taiwan to become a subsequent contributor in the trust fund. We hope that, as is required also under the compact, the U.S. can also help us find subsequent contributors instead of also putting more resources into the trust fund in the upcoming negotiations, either by extending the full term of the compact extension period to address the shortfalls in the trust fund.
Thank you. I know my time has expired, but Ambassador, you can submit it for the record later on because I don't want to
Yeah, thank you.
piece off the amendment.
Thank you, Congresswoman Gonzalez Colon. I've just been told that the committee is going to need the room after this, so we won't be able to have additional time for a second round of talks. But let me take my 5 minutes and ask. I will, Ambassador, submit questions for the record. I would like for you to respond to those in writing. But let me go this way. Ambassador Susaya and Ambassador Jacques, today we heard the importance of sustaining the relationship between the United States and the freely associated states. So as we look ahead to 2023, how can our committees or the United States Congress be more helpful? Or are there any further recommendations you would like us to keep in mind? A minute and a half. Ambassador?
Thank you, Chairman. If I may, I'd like to take the first crack at the question, and my colleague here can help. We are mindful of the role that the Congress plays in the review and approval of any agreement that will be negotiated between our negotiators and the U.S., especially your Committee on Natural Resources and Foreign Affairs, the role that you play in terms of the jurisdiction of these types of agreements. And so I wish on behalf of the FSM to ask that the review and approval process, knowing how the legislative process in the Congress plays, that it be done on a timely and expeditious basis. As you alluded to in your earlier statements to the other panel, the experience that Palau has, we really don't want to go down that same road. Thank you, Chairman.
And any other thoughts and ideas you have, you could submit them in writing.
Yes.
Ambassador Jacques, please.
I'd like to associate myself with those comments by Ambassador Susaya, but also say that in the case of the Marshall Islands, one thing that we'd like the committee to bear in mind, the joint committees, and we want to thank the House for passing the $20 million that will go into the trust fund. I think that's a very important start as we discuss this issue, so that the commitment to pay the $20 million, I think it's a very important one to start the relationship. You know, we were asked other questions about the need to continue this relationship. It's a very important relationship. We say that it started after World War II. I would like to say that it started in the 1800s with the Boston missionaries actually visited the islands. But the relationship and the extension of this relationship is very important, as we have heard also, the pressure that's being put on these small island countries. China is very aggressively in the islands and is trying to influence, coerce these countries to change their relationship. Yeah. The Marshall Islands is firm with its commitment to the U.S. In fact, President Heine has said that we are open to providing additional space for strengthening of the partnership for defense purposes. So the extension of this relationship, the speed of which we will conclude this relationship, the level of the people that will participate, and the amount of resources that is required is fully important for the committee.
Thank you, Ambassador. Ambassador Jacques, one of the 16 people who petitioned the United Nations Committee on the Rights of the Child this week for action on climate change was from the Marshall Islands. I do not know how we can talk about reviewing the Compact of Free Association with your nation without acknowledging that much of the Marshalls is in danger of disappearing in the years ahead. And so I have to think that this reality must be in the minds of many in the Marshalls and in your mind, and may influence what you want to achieve in the Compact renewal negotiations. I'll let you know that I acknowledge that, and that I will continue to encourage my colleagues to keep that in mind also. Dr. Gudnick, I brought you back for two reasons. One, and I got 45 seconds. One, Dr. Gudnick, is that there's always this disagreement on how to allocate, how to determine, how to put value on the cost of compact impact aid. I mean, of course, you know, the territories and the state of Hawaii, for example, always have their own numbers, and that everyone who comes in and is already signed up as someone who identifies as Tsukis is a FAS citizen, even if that person is fully employed and contributing to that state or territory, even if that person happens to be Tsukis but is born in that state or territory. There's been no definition of how to identify, use a common denominator to estimate the cost of compact impact to the state, but it is huge. There's no question about it. But I want to ask you, Dr. Gunik, and if you can't answer right now, then please submit for the record. Your GAO's 2018 report noted that the Federated States of Micronesia and the Republic of the Marshall Islands Compact Trust Funds face risk and will not provide disbursements in some future years. So has GAO concluded how much additional contributions are needed to reduce the risk of no disbursements?
So I think the issue is more with respect to the structure of the trust fund. Trust fund, when it was set up, was very much set up with in an effort to maintain the corpus of the trust fund. So the net effect of that with the trust fund rules is that it constrains disbursement. And I don't know that I have a specific figure for you, and I don't know that one could develop.
You can provide it for us.
I will think about your question. I'm not sure
Thank
that
you.
under the current rules, one could come up with a specific answer to it.
Thank you, but give us your best answer. I know you will.
I would like to mention one, since you brought me back, one quick point on compact migration. First thing is, there's no question that the right to migrate is a linchpin of the compacts. So it's there. There's also no question that compact citizens migrate primarily for economic reasons, for work, to educate their children, and to take care of health care needs. At the same time, there is also no question that there are financial costs. I have teams that have been out there in the past and a team that has just recently returned, speaking to state officials, speaking to compact migrants, and speaking to Micronesian officials. It is the case that the single most significant thing and prevalent thing that is cited is access to Medicaid. That prior to 1996, there was access to Medicaid. Subsequent to 1996 welfare reform, there have been a number of machinations in Hawaii, for example, but there isn't access. And I think with respect to the federal government's role, well, not taking a position one way or the other, that is the biggest issue that's out there.
Thank you, Dr. Gunik. I don't want to be accused that I'm abusing this seat, but at this time, I'd like to recognize the distinguished gentle lady from American Samoa, Ms. Riley Wagon, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'll try to keep it short. I have several questions I wanted to ask, but in the interest of time, I will submit them and then ask for the answers to be submitted later. But there are many unaddressed issues relating to the U.S. testing of 67 nuclear bombs on formerly populated islands in the RMI. And this question's for Ambassador Zackius. Most recently, as you noted in your testimony, there's great concern about the leakage of radioactive waste from the U.S. nuclear tests buried at the Runit Dome on Enuitak. The House passed National Defense Authorization Act for FY 2020 requires a study of Runit. And I want to say that I'm greatly concerned about the current situation on Enuitak. Are there other lingering issues from the U.S. nuclear legacy that should be kept in mind in a compact extension?
Thank you, Congresswoman. In addition to what I stated in my testimony about the Runit Dome and the conveyance of gratitude for the efforts that are currently undertaken, yes, there are issues that are unresolved from the nuclear testing program under the Section 177 agreement. Of course, as we understand, that agreement is a espousal agreement, but it also provides for for change circumstance petition. The Marshall Islands submitted a change circumstance petition to Congress in the year 2000, and that petition to address these lingering issues of shortfalls, to address cancers, land remediation, and other things relative to the testing program has not been fully addressed. So I think it's also important to look at the change circumstance and other issues that are currently before the Congress, including what is already before the Congress with regards to Ruined Dome.
Thank you, Ambassador. So I guess I'll put a second question in there. After all, I am entitled to 5 minutes. A recent report by the RAND Corporation noted that China is likely to seek ways to challenge American dominance with its Pacific Island allies by floating economic incentives to the FAS in exchange for loosened ties to Washington. RAND further concluded that, quote, going forward, the United States should demonstrate their commitment to the region by maintaining appropriate levels of funding to the FAS and strengthening engagement with the FAS more broadly. Failure to do so would be a self-inflicted wound that could come at the expense of the foreign policy and defense interests of the United States. So, Ambassador Zackius, please tell us how China is developing influence in the RMI, and what more can the United States do to demonstrate its commitment to the region?
Thank you, Congressman. With respect to that question, it's a very important question. First, I would say that China is developing its influence in the islands. If we can look at the activity that's currently taking place between the U.S. And China in the Marshall Islands, 2.2 billion of trade was done between China compared to $311 million of trade with the Marshall Islands. Additionally, telecommunication, Huawei is very involved in the islands through their telecommunication system. And there is so much personal persuasion by China. It's courting our leaders to China, taking them to Beijing. So the importance, as you have rightly stated, about putting resources there is very important, sufficient resources to address this relationship. We talked about discouraging this, and we talked about what other opportunities you have to look at in preparing yourself. We have the ship registry, and it was said in testimony earlier that China is penalizing our vessels that fly the RMI flag. As you're fully aware, we're the second largest flag in the world, and they're paying heavier taxes because of our relationship with the United States. So those are issues that China is doing in the islands. As I said in my statement, they were trying to build a project and proposal on Grand Lab Atoll, which is very proximate to Kwajalein, 1,000 houses, and that created a place almost similar to Hong Kong that would be autonomous from the Republic of the Marshall Islands. In fact, their last attempt was to move a motion of no confidence by pressuring our leaders to move a motion of no confidence in our current government because of this pressure to make the change.
Thank you, Your Excellencies. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And without objection, all members may have 5 days to submit questions, statements, and extraneous materials for the record, subject to the length limitations in the rules. Having no further business of this hearing. Huh? Oh, yeah, and of course, thank you. Thank you very much. I'm sorry, I have a Virgin Islander here who's reminding me that I have to be a mic. Thank you very much. I will come back and talk to you, Dr. Goodnick. Thank you always, sir. We would continue to need your guidance, and particularly on this one issue that's never going to go away is how to find which interior should do some kind of methodology to determine the cost, the value of compact impact to the several jurisdictions that are actually paying for the cost of migration now. But Thank you, everyone, and this hearing is adjourned.